Alrighty, so we are obviously going to be talking about change data capture today. We're going to talk a little bit about what CDC is just to get us started. So if anybody out there is unaware of, excuse me, unaware of what CDC actually is, we'll kind of do a little bit of an overview first, and then we'll hop in and show you how to consume CDC using some of the new components in SSIS 2012. So I have a little bit of a demo beforehand just to kind of show you what we used to have to do. So that way, hopefully you guys can see what's awesome about the 2012 version. So there's my contact information down the bottom right-hand corner of the slide there. Feel free to shoot me an email or check out my blog. I've got a demo of this walkthrough that I'm going to put up on my blog tonight on CDC, so you guys can go through there and follow it. You'll see whenever I get in here, I've also got a whole solution demo. We're not going to go through the whole demo because some of it's not SSIS specific. There's actually just a database level CDC, not SSIS consumption of CDC in there. So I'll put that out there for you guys to download and walk through as well. Alrighty. So real quick before we get in here, a little bit about myself. If you guys have ever seen my presentations before, most of this is probably familiar to you guys. I work at Pragmatic Works there in Jacksonville, Florida. Currently I'm up in Minneapolis, freezing. So snow cone facts were very fitting for the day. I blog at bradleyshack.com, so if you are curious about any of the content that I've got out there, go check that out. I also blog over at SQL Server Central and BIDN. So I write books with some guys at Pragmatic Works as well, and I do all kinds of speaking events. So enough about me, let's talk about change data capture. So first of all, we come up with a question, obviously baselining everything here. What is change data capture? So CDC essentially goes out and it detects all the changes that happen inside your database. Those include your inserts, your updates, and your deletes. So what happens is you create a table in your transactional system that houses all of your customer information, for instance. Every time that you update a customer record, let's say their address, what CDC is going to do is it's going to read that information from the log, all the updates, and then it's going to put those into change tables. So if you guys look at this little diagram over here on the left-hand side, essentially you can think of these tables here. These would be the tables that would normally be inside your source system. Okay? So that could be something like your employee table, maybe an employee table, a customer table, and a date table, for instance. So anytime that there's an update, those all get written over to your log file. And what change data capture does is it reads the log file for any of those changes, those inserts, updates, and deletes, and then it moves those changes, you'll see here, into these change tables. Okay? So it's going to move all those changes over here into the change tables, and then we have built-in functions that we'll use to query those change tables. And you can have up to 2 sets of tracking per table, and I'll talk a little bit more about that 2 sets of tracking once we get in and we start looking at, we actually start looking at what's going on inside of here. Okay, so detects changes, reads the log file, puts those changes into another table, and then we can essentially read from those change tables rather than having to go all the way back to our source table. What this allows us to do is, let's say that we want to load our data warehouse daily, or weekly, or whatever the frequency of that happens to be. Change data capture will allow us to go in and pull back only the records that have changed since the last time I loaded my data. So all we have to do is go to this change table using these functions. We feed it a couple of dates, and what we get back is all the change data between this time yesterday and right now. So what change data capture is not, it is not change tracking. So there's another feature in SQL Server called change tracking. What happens in change tracking is it's really just a simple event. It basically tells you, hey, something changed in the system, and then you can go and you can pull the data. With CDC, we actually store all the data that has changed inside those change tables. What you'll actually see in there is if you do an update, we actually store the previous version and the current version of the records. Whereas change tracking, you just have to go out there and you have to pull in the changed records. So change tracking isn't as good for reloading potentially history because you don't get all those different snapshots in time. Whereas the change tables, they store every change that happens in the time period, so we can actually go get any version of the record that we want. Change data capture is also not as lightweight as change tracking, so we have to have extra storage in order to do CDC because we have all these extra change tables over here that we're going to create. We also have to have a couple of jobs that are going to run in the background because this, you see these two processes here, this capture process and the ETL down here. So we have to have some extra things to run to actually detect those changes. So there's a couple of jobs involved in there. And then we also have to read those logs with the jobs and then clear out those change tables. So there's a lot more involved in CDC than there is inside of change tracking. All right, couple of small requirements here. So we do have to enable CDC both on the table level and on the database level, rather on the database level then on the table level. So there are two settings there. You don't have to install or you don't have to enable CDC on every table. You do that on a specific set of tables. You can even go down, and I'll show you guys how to do this. You can even go down and turn CDC on only specific columns. And we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get into a demo after just a couple more slides here. The other thing that this does, the other requirement here is I mentioned there were two jobs. One, we have this capture process job here that reads the log file and moves the changes from the log file into these change tables. There's a second job that's not depicted on this image over here on the left-hand side, and that other job is a table cleanup. So by default, the changes are going to be stored in these tables here for 3 days. There's a system level setting. I have to go look and see where it is, but there's a system level setting that tells you how long the records stay in these change tables. So process 1 reads the log, moves the data over to the change tables. The other job that runs, it's scheduled by default to run at 2 a.m. It does the table cleanup. So it will remove any records out of here that are more than 3 days old. Okay. SSI does work with Oracle Change Data Capture, so if you are using Oracle Change Data Capture, you can integrate that directly here with SSIS as well. And then you do need to have Enterprise Edition of SQL Server. Okay. So ultimately what we care about, so we kind of know what change data capture is. Now it's going to check all these changes anytime we make an update or anything like that. It's going to move all those changes into those change tracking tables, and then we need to pick that data up somehow. So how are we going to pick that up? We're going to use SSIS. We absolutely could just go up there and query it using the built-in functions, but what you're going to see is those built-in functions can be a little bit cumbersome. They're not necessarily as intuitive as you would think. To go out there and pull data in, and you end up with some errors sometimes depending on what you're trying to do. SSIS now in 2012 has some really nice integration with some new components that they added. It really simplifies the whole design process because you no longer have to write any queries. What you're going to see is the only queries that we're going to write are update statements and delete statements. So we're not going to write any source queries. We're not going to write any destination queries. We're just going to use the built-in tasks and transforms and come over and pull all the changed records out of our database. Okay? So we do need two different packages. We need one package to do the initial load of our data, and then we need a second, excuse me, a second SSIS package to do all the incremental loads. So there's a little bit different process that you follow with each one of those, and that's going to come down to those settings that are inside of our CDC Control Task, which we'll look at here in just a moment. The one limitation that we have here, though, is we can only pull from a single table as our source. And what I mean from that is this CDC source that we have here will only allow you to pull from one table. If we were to write a query using the built-in functions, we could join those table value functions together and pull from multiple tables in our source system. The one disadvantage here with SSIS components is we can only pull from one table. So I see there is a question here. It says, is CDC and SSIS the preferred method? My personal preference is to use change data capture when possible, just because, one, it really simplifies your ETL process. You don't have to go and detect changes in the ETL or detect changes on your destination system. If you can turn it on that source system, it's a really great way to be able to automatically detect changes and really streamline your ETL. I also prefer to do it in SSIS rather than do it in like just moving the data over and then doing a merge statement or something like that, which you certainly can do. But if you've got the ability and your design meets the necessary requirements to fit that into an SSIS ETL, SSIS is a really good way to be able to wrap that into a repeatable process. So my preferred method when possible is to use SSIS and CDC in combination with each other. But of course you obviously don't have to do that. Okay. So there's two things that we're going to look at, the control flow and the data flow, as with most SSIS packages. In the control flow we have one new task. It's called the CDC Control Task. This helps us control whether we're doing a reload, so that's initial load, or whether we're doing an incremental. Essentially what happens whenever CDC reads the transaction log, and anytime you have a change or anything gets written to the transaction log, you end up with what's called a log sequence number, or an LSN. And that marks the start time and end time, or like what time the transaction occurred, essentially, inside your transaction log. So what the CDC control task is going to basically store the starting LSN and the ending LSN for the time period that we're going to be pulling data in for. What this will allow us to do is then turn around and log that into a table so that we know what the last time we pulled data in from. So where to go in the log, where the log sequence number is a unique spot in the transaction log. So we're going to go to that location in the transaction log and only pull in the changes that have happened since the last time we ran the package. So the CDC control task, as you'll see, is going to help us manage and store those log sequence numbers inside of a table so that we only pull a new set of data each time we run the package. And of course, I have stuff copied on my slides twice there. Okay. On the data flow side, we have two different components. We have two additional components. So we have the CDC source, which, as you'll see here in a minute, we have a bunch of functions that we can use inside of change data capture. And essentially the source is going to write all those functions for us so that we don't have to. Greatly going to simplify what we're doing inside of there. What you'll also see whenever we look at the change tracking tables is that each one of these, each one of the operations, they get a different change data capture ID, or a number that's associated with it. It's going to be a number that's 1 through 4. So 1 being an insert, 2 being a delete, I believe, 3 is the before version of the record before an update, and 4 is the same version of the record after the update. So what we're basically going to do is look at that number and determine whether the row is an insert, an update, or a delete. So we could do all that with a conditional split, but they've built a CDC splitter here so that we don't have to set up and maintain that conditional split. So CDC splitter, you can really think of that as a conditional split without us having to do any setup work. Okay, so it's enough talking about this. Let's actually hop over and take a look at CDC in action here. So I have myself here. I have a bunch of scripts here. As I mentioned, I'll put these all up on my blog for you so that you guys can go through them. We're only going to go through a subset of these because we obviously don't have time to do every single one of these. So we're going to run through the list here, do a few of them, and then hop over into SSIS once we've kind of gotten an idea as to how this works and show you how to integrate this with SQL Server integration services. So the first thing that we need to do here, I'm just working on my local instance. First thing that we need to do, let me actually make sure I'm on my local instance. Okay, so here's my list of databases. First thing we're going to do is create ourselves a new CDC database. So just create us a blank database where we can play around for the rest of this webinar here. So I'm going to go ahead and execute this. It's going to create my database. Let me bring over my Object Explorer here. I actually want to do, come on. Okay, Object Explorer is float. There we go. Put this one down here at the bottom so that we can see my Object Explorer as well as our scripts here. So there's that database I just created. If we go in here, you'll notice there's no tables inside of here, nothing inside of it. We just created ourselves a blank database. The other thing that we're going to do here is I'm actually going to start my SQL Server agent. So we're going to start SQL agent because if you guys remember, there's a couple of jobs that we said that we needed to run in the background here. So we have to have the SQL agent running. I guess I probably should have put that on the requirements tab there, but we have to have the SQL agent running to run that log reader job. and that's going to come up here in a moment. So as you can see here, blank environment, no CDC enabled anywhere, no extra jobs in there. That's just the default one that's there whenever you install SQL Server, and we kind of have a clean slate to start with here. This next procedure that I'm going to run is just to populate some data. So I've basically taken the data from the product table out of AdventureWorks and scripted it out here, and then here's all the data that goes along with it. So first thing we're going to do, we're going to run this. Now you'll see we have 504 records in the product table, and we have 128 records in our product model table. Again, we'll come over here, we'll do a refresh. See 2 tables here, no system tables, no extra system tables or anything like that inside of here, just the 2 tables that we've created there. So I mentioned one of the requirements was that we needed to enable CDC both on the database level as well as on the table level. So what we're going to do in order to enable CDC on the database level, and make this a little bit bigger for you guys, what we're going to do to enable this on the database level is just run a simple system store procedure. So we're going to go to that change data capture database that we just made, and then we're going to run sys.sp_cdc enable db. And this is going to enable CDC on this database that we're in the context of. So we'll go ahead and run this. Takes just a moment there. We'll go ahead and do a quick refresh. See system tables. Now we have a couple of system tables here. So DDL history, what this is going to do is if we ever modify the structure of a table, it's going to put some information here into the DDL history, and it's going to update your change tracking tables for you. So if we move something from, say, a decimal 1015 or decimal 10.5 down to a decimal 10.3, then that history, that DDL change, is going to get logged in the history table, and if any of the data gets modified at that point, it's going to put those records into the change tracking tables as well. So we have a couple of different things here that get created whenever we turn CDC on at the database level. If we come over here and refresh our jobs, you notice still no jobs here at this point. The other thing that we'll do is, let me expand the roles here. And keep in mind, these are just the standard roles that are inside of here. We'll come back to this one in just a minute, but before I go any further, I did want to show you no additional database roles have been created in here just yet. Okay. Luckily, if we want to do a query to figure out whether or not CDC is enabled, so I can actually come up here. If I just run this again, you're going to get a little message here that says change data capture is already enabled. Make sure the database context is set correctly, blah, blah, blah. Essentially, we're saying CDC is already enabled on this database. Well, maybe we want to just know if CDC is enabled on my databases or not. We can actually just query sys.databases, and there's actually a column inside that table called is CDC enabled, and it's just a bit field. So we can actually query that and see which of our databases change data capture is currently turned on. And right now, we only have it turned on the change data capture database. If we want to disable CDC on our database, all we have to do is run sp_cdc disable db. Okay? So I'll have that one in there for you guys as well. And again, keep in mind I will put all these up on my blog for you guys to be able to run through and play around with later on your own. Okay? So we've enabled CDC on the database level. The next thing that we need to do is enable CDC on the table level. So what we have here is another store procedure, just sp_cdc enable table. So we had sp_cdc enable db for the database level, and now we have sp_cdc enable db, or enable table, excuse me, for the table level. So if we were to run this here, if we go through this, so the source schema, so the schema here, the source table, source name is going to be your table name, so this is in dbo.product. dbo.product. The role name, this is going to be the administrator of the CDC job. So this is going to grant some permissions in order for CDC to be able to read the table and move this data over into the change tracking tables. I mentioned that you can actually have 2 capture instances, or 2 instances of CDC running against any single table at a given time. So that's what this capture instance parameter here is for. So we're going to give this capture instance a name. We can call this anything that we want. We can call it product, we can call it webinar, doesn't matter. It doesn't have to match the name of the table, but we just need to tell it what the capture instance is going to be called. This next option here supports net changes. You'll see in just a second that there's a couple of functions that are going to be created. So if we come over here into the functions, table value functions, I currently don't have anything. But this support net changes, whenever I use that option, it's going to create a function in here that allows me to get back the net changes as opposed to just all the changes. So that's usually a good thing to turn on because more often than not, we only care about what has changed, the net changes since the last time we pulled data, not all of the changes inside of our table. Okay, so these are really the ones that I would say that you need to run every time that you enable CDC. These are the parameters. These are the base set of parameters that you need here. This last option here is kind of a cool one because if we all know that if you're pulling data out of a source system like a transactional system and loading into your warehouse, for instance, we don't need every single column from our table. So if we're pulling data out of a customer table, for instance, we might have 20 or 30 columns inside that customer table, but inside of our warehouse, maybe we only care about 10 of them. Well, this capture column list is going to essentially tell us which columns change tracking or change data capture is monitoring. So in my product table, as you guys saw, I have many more columns than just the ID, the name, the number, the color, and the model. So what we're saying here is if there's a change to the product size, I don't want that change to be logged inside of the table. If there's a change to the class, I don't want that to be logged inside of my change tracking table. Only changes to these fields will be logged inside of our change tracking table. Okay. So one other requirement that we do have here at the table level is that we do have to have a primary key on the table. So you'll notice I have my product ID listed inside of there, but you do have to have the primary key inside of your change tracking, as well as you do have to have a primary key on the table. Okay. All right, so that's the enable for our product table. I also have the product model inside of here. You'll notice this one I've got the capture column list commented out. So if you don't provide a capture column list, we are going to capture all the columns inside the table. So any change inside the table will be captured against the product model table. There are a couple of other additional parameters that you can apply down here. There's lists of all these things are listed in books online if you want a little bit more in-depth explanation of each of these. The capture column list you saw there. The file group, this is the one that they're going to tell you is important because this is basically telling us what file the file group where the change tracking tables are going to be placed, so that it, less impact on your system if it's in a separate file group than the actual table itself. And do we want to allow partition switching in the table that we're tracking changes on? So we can tell it that we don't want to allow partition switching. If you do allow partition switching, this is pretty important. So partition switching is only a metadata operation. No data actually moves around whenever you do that. So when you enable partition, if you do allow partition switching, which is allowed by default, and you switch in a partition, that does not get tracked by change data capture. So if you switch in 1,000 records, 1,000 new records into your table, that will not get picked up by CDC. Okay, so let's go ahead and run these couple up here. We're going to enable change data capture on both of these tables. It's going to take just a second because it's building some jobs in the background. It's building some extra tables, and then you'll notice that we have a couple of jobs here that were created. So these are those two jobs I mentioned to you guys earlier. So if we refresh down here, there's that change data capture and then the change data capture cleanup. So the cleanup is the one that clears out those change tracking tables. The capture is the one that actually runs that reads the transaction log. So if we go back through our database here, I'm going to go ahead and refresh our table list. We still only have those two tables, but if we go to our system tables now, what you notice is I have this product underscore CT, so product underscore change track, and product model change tracking. And we can go in here. Let's see, I've got a couple of queries here. And if we query this, what you notice is there's the starting log sequence number and the ending log sequence number. So the chain that's logging the log sequence number for the change that was occurring. This operation, once we get some data in here, you're going to see that this is going to be those things like your 1 for your inserts or your 3 for your previous version of the record before the update, and then each one of the different columns that we're tracking. So we are tracking changes on the name, the product number, the color, the product model, and then our product ID was the key on the table. Okay. Same thing down here for product model. We just have some extra columns in here because of the because we told it to track changes on all the columns, not just a specific list. Okay. So those are a couple of new things there. If we come down here and we refresh our table value functions, you see now we have two different sets of functions in here, product, model, and product. But what you notice is this get all changes and get net changes. So the parameter here, support net changes, I told you when you set that to 1, that tells CDC that it's going to create this net changes for each of the tables. Okay. It's always going to create the all changes. You can optionally create the net changes, so whether or not it supports net changes. Okay. And again, like I said, more often than not, this is going to be something that you want inside of there. Okay. Finally, let's go over here and let's look at the database roles. So we'll refresh this, and then there's that CDC admin role. And if we go inside of here and we look at the securables, you'll see it's got some rights here on each of these different functions that we created there, and it's got select on that CDC there. Okay, so that's the role name there. Obviously, you can create different roles for different change tracking on different tables. So how you set those roles and that kind of stuff up is up to you. But you will notice that the name of that does fall in line with what we put in here. All right, so now that we've got this created, let's talk about how to actually use this. So this is going to be the previous way that we would use CDC. This is a little bit more cumbersome way, and then I'll show you real quickly the easier way to do it with SSIS. So if I come over here and I'm going to create a control table, and all this control table is really going to store for me is the last time that I pulled in and that I read data out of the product model or the product table. So real simple. We just need to keep track of when we actually pulled data in so that we can only pull in data since that date. So I'm not going to go fully into creating the wrappers here, but what the wrapper function essentially is, you'll notice that inside of here, if you read through this whole thing, it's going to call those functions that we saw over here, the net changes and all changes. It just makes it a little bit easier because these functions here, these require you to pass in a log sequence number. This particular wrapper function, you can actually just pass in a date time. So you don't have to go and pull in the log sequence number. You can actually just pull in the date time, just pass in the date time, and it will determine the correct log sequence numbers for you. I've done a little bit of work inside of this particular procedure to determine things like type 2 changes. You'll notice I've got some comments in here as to where I made some changes and why I did what I did inside of here. So I'll let you guys take a look through these again once I put this on my blog later. You guys can take a look through that, and if you have any questions about why I did something inside of this wrapper function here, just let me know and I'd be more than happy to give you a little bit better explanation as to what's going on here. Ultimately, though, long and the short of this particular wrapper function here is that I want to be able to pass this a date rather than a log sequence number, and we'll be able to use that here in just 1 second. So I'm going to go ahead and create that wrapper function. Again, this is something that was very common to do previously, and this was really the best way to pull in the changes prior to using SSIS in 2012. Okay. So first thing we're going to do here is we're going to run this select here. Obviously, I shouldn't get anything back from my change table here because I haven't added any data. You know, we added some data originally, but I haven't made any modifications to the data since we enabled change tracking. So I just have this select end date down here so I can go and update my control table. So what I'm going to do here is tell my control table that the last time I selected data was at 10:30 Central Time here, and I'll run that quick update. So what I want to do is I actually want to insert some data into the table. So we're going to run that and then come back over here and run our function. So what you notice here is when I ran that function, it didn't detect any changes in the table. So what you'll find is there's a little bit of a lag. So that log reader job that runs in the background, it has to run and read the changes in the log and then insert those changes into the change tracking table. So if you run an insert and then you immediately run the select statement, you're probably not going to see any changes, depending on how large that operation is. It usually only takes a second or two for that to catch up, so it's not something you have to like wait 5 minutes for. It is fairly quick. It's just if you happen to run the two right back to back, you're not going to see that change show up in the table. Okay, so there's my new record that I added. See, the CDC operation here is an I for insert, and I can come over to my change tracking tables, go to product, and there's the operation. Oh, I said operation 1 earlier was the insert. It looks like operation 2 is the insert. So I do have in one of these stored procedures here, I have listed the different operations and what they correspond to. So insert operation there, product ID, number -2, the product name, the number, the color, and the model. So all the changes get tracked there in that change tracking table. That wrapper function that we created is going to go and give me all the changes out of that change tracking table since the last time I ran it. So again, we're going to go over here. We're going to update our control table. Tell it this is the last time that we ran our select statement was 1031. Okay, we'll execute that. And then let's go ahead and run an update. So we'll run an update. Come over here, run this. And there's our updates. We updated our product color from orange to yellow. And this time, update new, so UN, as I mentioned, the change tracking table here actually stores the old version of the record, so that's operation number 3, and the new version of the record, which is operation number 4 there. So we do get both versions of the record if you ever want to come in here and take a look at what the records used to look like before the update. Okay. So now let's update a non-tracked column. So if you guys remember, these are the only columns that we're tracking changes on: the name, number, color, and model. So if I come over here, let me actually do my update on my control table here again. So we'll update our control table. If we run our function again, we haven't made any changes yet, so nothing comes back. So let's update a non-tracked column here. So like the make flag, we're going to set that to 1. If I do an execute, I've updated one row in the table, but if I come over here and I run this, I've mentioned it might take a couple seconds for the reader to catch up, but you can see I can still run this a number of times, but nothing ever shows up inside that change tracking table. So it's only going to pull in the changes since the last time I ran on the tracked columns. So it's a really nice feature, again, being able to tell it which columns that you want to track. Okay. So let's go ahead and we'll do one more update here to our product ID, or to the product model rather. And there's the update new again, and now the model number there has changed. Okay. So real simple to do. Once you get that wrapper function in there, it's not really a difficult thing to do. The difficult piece comes whenever you start trying to wrap this into a repeatable process, because what you end up having to do in SSIS now is not only do I have to write this query inside of here, I have to do this query and modify it for each individual table that I'm going to be pulling in changes for. I also have to create this wrapper function for each of those tables that I'm going to be pulling in. I then have to write some logic to go in and update the control table with the last time that I updated the data. I also have to build my own conditional split to determine whether to figure out what needs to happen when this is a new update as opposed to an inserted record or a deleted record. So there's a lot of work that goes into just creating a single SSIS package, no less a series of SSIS packages that will provide this change capture functionality to only pull the changes and new records into my downstream environments. Okay. So what I'm going to show you guys next, now that we've kind of got an idea of how change data capture works, you guys see the change tracking tables that go into this, what these functions do, all that kind of stuff. Now let's take a look and see how we can use SSIS to make this process a little bit easier for us. So we don't want to have to come in here and create these wrapper functions. We don't want to have to do this maintenance on the control table, this change tracking table here. We just want to be able to plug in a couple of little things and pull back all the changes out of our environment. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and close this one here, but I'm going to keep the change tracking table here open. So here you see all of our changes. There was the insert that we did, the previous version of the record and the updated version of the record, and then again the previous version and updated version of our records. Okay. So I see one of the questions here is how hard is it to update the captured column list to add another column? If you need to add additional capture columns, you have to disable CDC or disable that capture instance of CDC and then re-enable it. So adding new columns is not really that difficult. Just keep in mind whenever you do disable that change tracking, what's going to happen is it's going to remove all those change tracking tables and all the functions and everything associated with it. So it's a little bit cumbersome, but it is something that you can do just by disabling and re-enabling the change tracking on that table. So another question here says if we're using SSIS, do we still need to enable CDC on the database and table level? Absolutely. So SSIS is really those last two, basically this last one that we just looked at here, this creating the wrapper and this modified version of the wrapper and that whole demo that we just went through. Essentially, SSIS is going to do some of that work for us. So we still need to enable change data capture. We just don't have to create as many functions and that kind of stuff to get us going here. Another question here says, is it sustainable for highly transactional tables? I've used it on some pretty highly transactional tables in the past. I don't know, you'd probably have to do some testing to see how performant it is on very highly transactional. I see the number you gave here is like 5,000 transactions a second. Just keep in mind that log reader does take some time to read all those changes and move those into those change tracking tables. So it might just be something you need to test and see if it will keep up with the system. Another option is, and the way that I generally do this is, rather than passing in get date into that wrapper function or telling it to pull changes up to now, I would tell it, pull changes up to maybe an hour ago or 10 minutes ago. That way you ensure that log reader has a little bit of time to catch up with all the transactions in there. One other question here we'll answer before we get going on the SSIS side of things says, is there a way to track the user that caused the update or delete? Unfortunately, this is all the information that you see right here in this table. This is everything we get. You'd have to have another column on the table just like you would anyway for the updated by or deleted by, that kind of thing. I'm not aware of any way to get the actual user that issued the transaction that caused the update or the delete. Okay. All right, so let's hop over to SQL Server Data Tools here and show you guys how this works inside of SSIS. So before we do that, though, I'm going to create a new database here. So we're going to pull all the data. We've got the change tracking, change data capture enabled and tracking changes here on our change data capture database. I'm going to create us a new database and a couple of tables inside said database. Create some tables here. So what we want to do here is we want to load all the changes, all of our records into this product table. So let me do a refresh, change data capture destination. So there's that product table. Keep in mind, whenever this would be maybe your data warehouse and this would be your transactional system, for instance. So keep in mind, change data capture is only enabled on the source system. So we don't need to enable CDC on the destination, only need to enable CDC on the source system, on the source database, and on the source tables inside that database. So we want to load this product table from everything that we have inside and all the changes that occur inside this change data capture database here. All right, so we'll come over here, we'll create a new project, SSIS project here, we'll call this CDC webinar. And let me go ahead and get us a couple, actually we'll create some connection managers as we go. So the first thing that we need to do is we need to set up our initial load package. I mentioned that we really need two SSIS packages. We need an initial load, and then we need an incremental load package to continue to use every time after the first run of it. So we're going to rename this package here to initial load. And the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to drag over one of our new tasks that we talked about called the CDC Control Task. So we're going to drag that one over here. See, start initial load. I'm going to open this up, and you'll notice that we have to create a couple of connections here. First of all, we have to have a connection manager to our source database. So this is going to be, it has to be an ADO connection manager, an ADO net connection manager to the source system where we're pulling the data out of. So we're going to create new here, and we'll do period. And we're pulling all this data out of our change data capture database. Say OK. And then we've got a couple of different operations here. What we want to do is say we want to mark the initial load. We're going to use these couple down here at the bottom for when we do our incremental loads. But first of all, we need to do the initial load of the package or of our data. So we're going to say we want to mark the initial load. Next thing that we need to do here is create a variable for the CDC state to be stored in. So if you guys remember before, what I said was this, if we pass in a date into one of those wrapper functions, it's going to translate that into a log sequence number, and then ultimately we need to track that inside of a table someplace. So this CDC variable is going to contain a lot of different information for us, but one of the things it's going to do is it's going to hold the log sequence numbers in order for it to track when we last pulled data, and also for it to be able to run the different functions inside of our CDC source that we're going to use in the next package. So you can call this variable anything you want. The default that it suggests for you is CDC state. That's going to be perfectly fine. And then down here at the bottom, a connection manager to our destination database. So we're going to create a new connection manager down here as well. So we'll do my local host, change data capture destination. And then we created a stage table before, if you guys remember. We created a table that said, here's the table that we were pulling data out of, and here's the last time that we pulled data for it. So this is going to do the same thing. It's just going to maintain all that information for us. So I'm going to say new. Notice it gives me the definition there. Just click run, called CDC states. And then we need to pick a CDC state name. So this is going to be something that's got to be table specific, and you have to remember this throughout the entire process. Or it doesn't necessarily have to be table specific, but you need to keep the same state name throughout the process. So it's going to default to CDC state. We can switch this over to mine if we wanted to. Just remember that we changed that to mine, because that's going to come up here in just a few moments again. So what we're doing here is we're marking the initial load. It's going to store that LSN and everything inside the CDC states table under the state name of mine. Okay? So that's step number one, create and mark the initial load of our data. Next thing that we need to do is just a simple data flow task. All we're going to do here is load all the existing data out of our table. So this is going to be a pretty easy one. Let me do some name changes to our ADO. Name changes on our connection managers down here, because this is going to get a little bit confusing if we don't. So we have our ADO connections down here. What we want to do is, again, just a simple OLEDB source down to an OLEDB destination. So we just need all the data out of our product table from change data capture, pull it out of our product table, and we want to load that into our change data capture destination, and into the product table that we created. There's a CDC states table that we created just a second ago. We want to load this data into our product table and then go to mapping here. Okay, everything's mapped, we're good to go. Simple data flow, source destination, just bulk load all of our data over is essentially what we're doing here. And then finally, on the initial load, we need to do another CDC control task. And this time, so we've got our source database there. This time, instead of marking the initial load, we want to mark the initial load end. So initial load start was what we did before. We want to mark the initial load end. So what's the variable that contains the CDC state? Same one that we used earlier. And then the destination database, so set all that same information up here. The table for storing the state was the CDC states table. And then the state name, don't forget, always if you change the state name, always make it the same as we had before. So this is, we're going to change that over to mine. Okay, so mine there, mine here on the destination. Oop. See what happened here. Come on. Table CDC states does not exist. Oh, switch the, I changed the name of the connection manager there, that's why. CDC states, mine, there we go. Alrighty, so what we're going to do here, let me hop over to our database here. I'm going to do a new query over here just to show you the CDC states table. Select star from CDC states and select star from product. Okay, so both of these are currently empty. I'm just going to add a couple of breakpoints here, and I'm going to run my package. So it's going to go out, it's going to get my log sequence number, it's going to log that inside my CDC states table. Again, keep in mind, no data has been loaded. If I run this here, you see IL start for my initial load start. The name that we gave it was mine. And then this is encoded with the log sequence number and time, some other information here. If I load my table, it has not run my CDC control task down here to log the ending. I'm going to notice that the state is still the initial load start, and I've loaded 505 records down here into the bottom. If I run this one more time, hit that last breakpoint, rerun this, initial load end. So we've now loaded the initial set of data into our table, and we're ready to build our incremental load from here on out. Okay, so a real simple process: mark the beginning, load the data, mark the end. Okay, so we're going to do one more SSIS package here. In these last 10 minutes, we're going to get our incremental load done. So we'll call this one incremental load. And then there's a couple of things that we're going to need to do here. So we need some. Let's go ahead and get the basis here into our package, and then as we go along here, we'll create a couple other tables because we are going to need to do some updates and deletes inside of our database. So first thing we're going to do, though, is we're going to drag over a control task. So we're going to say CDC incremental load start, and then at some point down here, we're going to have to do, kind of like we did before, CDC incremental load end. So before we said the initial load start and initial load end, we need to do the same thing here with our incrementals. So I'm actually going to come over here and let me convert these connection managers up to project level so I don't have to recreate all of them again. Convert to project. Okay. And now on my incremental load start, again, my source database, so it's ADO capture. This time, instead of an initial load start, I want to say get processing range. So what that's going to do is it's going to look at my CDC table. It's going to find out when it's going to look at the incremental or the initial load end. It's going to find out when I last pulled data in, and it's going to get the processing range up until now in order to load the changed data. So the variable, again, I don't have a variable. We'll just create a new one here. And then our destination, the table that we're storing the state in, and then the state name, as we did before, we need to switch it over to mine. Okay, so we're getting the processing range based on the CDC state that's stored in the states table under the name of mine. Okay, now here's where we get into the data flow and we do things a little bit different than we did before. So what we're going to do here is we're going to say, I need to open my data flow task, and rather than doing an OLADB source, we have a new source in here called the CDC source. So I'm going to drag that one over, and this is super simple to set up here. So our ADO connection manager to our source system, which is going to be change data capture, the CDC enabled table. So if the table does not have change data capture enabled, you will not see it in the drop down here. If we were to go disable product models change tracking, then it would not show up in this list here. So we want to choose product. The capture instance, I said you could have up to 2 capture instances on each one of the tables. So there you see the capture instance. So we can pick which one of those 2 we want to pull data from. So those could both be tracking different sets of columns, or maybe we're tracking some overlap in the columns, but they're going to 2 different systems. So we need to track different sets of columns. So there's a little bit of configuration you can do there to actually use the same set of change data capture for 2 different downstream systems potentially there. Okay. And then the CDC processing mode, this one's pretty important here. We want to set this to the net changes. So we only care about the net changes since the last time that we pulled data in from our source. We don't need all the changes, because then if we did like 5 or 6 different updates, we would get 5 or 6 updates coming through this process here. If we do net changes, we're only going to get the very last update that occurred. Okay. And then the variable containing the CDC state, again, we created that previously, so there's our CDC state. We come over here into the columns. These are the same columns that you guys saw, essentially the same columns from whenever we did the wrapper function and what that ended up producing for us. The starting LSN, whether it was an update new or an insert, there was a binary mask that gets put over that, and then each of the new columns and their values there. Okay, so real simple to set up that source there. Again, no queries. We didn't have to write any queries here at all. We didn't have to build any functions. We didn't have to build those wrappers. We could have skipped the whole wrapper thing and gone straight to here, and this whole thing would have worked perfectly fine. So no setup whatsoever as far as coding goes in order to make that source there happen. The next thing that we need to do in here is put our CDC splitter. So this splitter, nothing to configure here. If I come up, I just get the advanced editor screen. It's, as I mentioned before, it's a conditional split without us having to do any work. And then we're going to need 3 OLEDB destinations down here. So why we need these 3 destinations is, 1, we need to insert the records into the database. If there's any updates, we need to stage those someplace so that we can run an update statement. And if there's any deletes, we need to stage those someplace so that we can run the delete statement. So off of our splitter here, I'm going to have my inserts. Just pick the appropriate output based on the destination here. This is going to be all my updated records, and then this is going to be all my deleted records here. So we have to have some tables to store these 2 items in, and I happen to have a script that we can use here to do that, so we don't have to waste any time. So we're just going to do the select top 0 from product. So now we have a delete and an update table there. I also have some delete and update queries. We're going to need these both here in just 1 second. So let's go ahead and map these tables now we have everything created. Inserts are obviously going to go into our destination, but they're going to go directly into the product table. Nothing that we need to do there. If we had more columns, obviously in a real situation you need to map all of these columns, not just a couple of them. But since we're only tracking changes on a couple of columns, those are the only ones we have to map here. So just in real life, if you actually implement this, be sure to map all the columns, all the necessary columns here in your destination. On our update, again, go to our destination. Here we want to load our update table. Again, in our actual update table, if these were the only columns we had, we probably wouldn't have all the rest of these. And then finally, the delete table here at the end, product delete. We'll map all that, and everything's good to go there. All right. Next thing that we need to do, as we said here, we have to do some updates to our updates or delete the data. So we're going to just use a regular execute SQL task there. SQL update or delete. And we want to run these updates and deletes against that destination. We'll just paste that in there. Basically just joining the stage table with my the update table with the actual table and updating based on the product ID. So that's why that having the primary key in that table is also important. Okay, so we should be good there. And then the last thing that we need to do, if we're going to be running inserts, updates, deletes, that whole thing, we probably need to clear out those staging tables. My personal preference is to clear out all the stage tables at the beginning. So I'm going to do SQL truncate, update, and delete tables. This name is not long enough yet. Okay. So what we're going to do here, once again, my truncate table commands, we're just going to go into that destination there, and we're going to truncate remove the existing product updates and the existing deletes so that we don't try to update the same records twice. That would probably not work out so well for us. Okay? So the only thing that we have left here to do is configure this initial load end. So much like we've been doing, mark the process time range, the CDC state, switch this over to our destination, same CDC states table, and now mine. So what you'll notice here is, let's go ahead and run this incremental load. If we run this, hopefully nothing blows up on us. So everything looks good. If we come over to our data flow, nothing changed. This is kind of like the first query that we ran earlier when nothing changed, because we didn't bring anything into our, we didn't make any modifications to the data inside of our table. So if we run this, so this is going back to that CDC states table. Before this said I end, so it was that initial load end. Now you see it says TF end here. So this is, that's marking the end of an incremental process there. If I come over and I insert some records into the table, let me close out a couple of these other ones here. So if I were, say, our change tracking table, you can see still those only the changes that we made previously. If I come over here and I insert a new record into that table, I actually insert 2 records in there, and we come over to our change tracking table, what you're going to notice is there's the new records right there. Both of those were inserted. And if I run my select from the CDC states table, you'll see everything's still the same. It's still at the transaction end. But now I can come over and I can run my SSIS package. And what you're going to see happen here is 2 records got put down the insert route and were added into my table. If we come over here, we run this again, what you'll notice here at the very end is this timestamp, some of this stuff in the log sequence number in here, some of that information is going to get changed. This did end in 002 and now it's 004. Okay? So I can come over here and I can update, if I update this same record with product ID of -4, if I update that same record twice, what we should see, oops, so there's that record. So I want to update that same record 2 times. So what we're going to do here is we're actually updating the product model to -3 and -4. If I run that, and then let's go look at the change tracking table. So there's my change tracking table. You'll see that there's the 2 changes that I just made to the record. It updated it from null to -3 and then from -3 to -4. And then you can see that the data is actually changed here. If we run this now through our data flow, we should only see 1 record come through because we told that we want the net changes in this source, not all the changes. So there's, boom, 1 record came through. We look at the data in the table now, and if we come over here, our product model ID is -4, which was the last one that we updated. So that was the second update that we made. Again, try to update a column where no changes were made. If we come through here and we run our SSIS package now with no changes having been made, nothing comes through this destination here. So just like those functions that we looked at earlier, how it tracked, it only brought in the net changes, we don't have to worry about it bringing in all the changes or even changes on columns that we're not tracking. So it's pretty intelligent, real easy design here. Just mark the beginning point, load the data, update or delete, mark the end. No functions or anything like that that you have to run in order to make that happen. So just to wrap things up there, obviously, as I mentioned, CDC is not change tracking. It's a really great way to be able to maintain those changes inside your database. So definitely explore using that. If you guys have any questions, I know we definitely didn't get to all the questions here. I will do as I normally do. I always put a follow-up blog out on my blog there on bradleyshack.com. So Rachel always sends me all the questions from the webinar that I haven't gotten to answer during the webinar. So if you do have any questions, shoot me an email. Otherwise, check out on my blog there in the next probably tomorrow night. I'll have the answers to those questions up there, as well as a link to the recording if you guys need to come back and rewatch any portion of this, if anybody had to leave early or anything like that.